and he's here to discuss with us today the Federal Reserve, the IRS, income tax, debt, what they are, what they do, how they impact our personal freedom, and what we can do about it. I want to remind you all to please silence your cell phones, just like that. And don't get them too close to the microphone. And also, please hold your questions until the last 30 minutes. We're going to open up the floor for a Q&A session. All right, thanks again for being here, guys. And with that, and without any further ado, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. G. Edward Griffin.
Thank you. I just realized I'm the culprit. I turned on my microphone here while I was sitting in front of the speakers. Sorry about that. Well, thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to warn you that I have never given this talk before. Now, I don't know whether that's good or bad, but it could be bad because I tend to get long-winded. And even though I have approximately 90 minutes, I also have 7 pages of notes, and that's not a good omen. So what I want to do is just jump right into it and keep the wheels going, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A afterwards, and then I can pick up the pieces I missed along the way. I'd like to begin by telling you a little story. It's an apocryphal story, of course, but there was a motorcyclist back in the Northeast on one cold day. The temperature dropped suddenly, and he was going down the road, and it was getting colder and colder, and finally he said, "This is not working, I'm going to freeze to death." So he stopped his motorcycle, took his jacket off, and turned, because the wind was coming through the buttonholes, and it wasn't a zipper type, it was a buttonhole type. So he turned it around and put it on backwards so the wind wouldn't come through the buttonholes. And so he got back on his motorcycle, and that was a lot better. But unfortunately, he hit a patch of black ice, and he lost control, and he wound up wrapped around a tree. Well, he was unconscious, and the people came and saw it happen, and they were looking at him and looking at him. They were hovering over him, trying to see if he was okay. And so somebody called the ambulance. In a few minutes, the ambulance came, and the paramedics went over and looked at him, and he was dead. And they asked the people around there, said, "Well, what happened? Can you describe the accident?" He said, "Well, yeah, we saw the guy coming down here. He hit the patch of ice. He lost control, and he hit the tree. And we came over and looked at him, and by the time we got his head turned back around right, he was dead." Well, believe it or not, there's a connection between that story and what I want to talk about today, because the moral to that story, of course, as you probably have already guessed, is that if you don't understand the cause of a problem, you're sure as heck not going to come up with a solution. And in fact, if you do come up with a solution, it could make matters a lot worse than if you had just stayed away from it. And that really is what I'm going to be talking about, because that axiom is relevant to my topic. Because today, believe it or not, after all these many, many years I've been talking about problems, this is the first time that the sponsor of an event has specifically asked me to talk about the cause of the problems and not just the problems themselves. And so I'm delighted to do that. And I'm going to be talking about not only the problems relating to our monetary woes, monetary and banking crisis, and taxes, but I'll be talking about the cause of those as well. So I'm grateful to the sponsor here, as you all know, is Young Americans for Liberty. And because, you know, if we just look at the daily news about the unfolding events in the banking world and the economic world and the loss of jobs and the rising inflation and the crises around the world and riots here and all of these things, we may be very well informed, but we don't get any glimpse into the background as to why are these things happening And I would like to have more people think about the why, so that we can focus on not making these same mistakes in the future, so that we hopefully can stop this process from getting worse. And if we cannot stop it, at least we'll have a better chance of rebuilding from the rubble and avoid making the same mistakes over and over again. And what I will be talking about today is the fact that there is a cause, a very definite cause as I see it, behind these problems today. And the old system is falling apart because it was doomed to do that from the very beginning. It was programmed into it. It's not something that happened to it afterwards, but was programmed into it from the very beginning. Now, the purpose of my presentation is to show that these problems and many others, in addition to the ones I'll be talking about, by the way, are not caused by evil men doing evil things, or even by good men doing stupid things. Although both of those factors definitely are at work, you can't avoid seeing that. But these are not the primary causes of the problem. The primary cause, as I see it, is an idea. It's an idea that has literally swept the world. It is an idea that is cherished and embraced by almost all of the educated people of the world. They cherish it as the foundation of justice and fairness, and democracy is a word we'll be talking about a lot. And so they cherish it. They cherish the very thing which is at the cause of our problems today. I call this the idea X. I call it idea X because for most people it really is unknown. They embrace it, but they don't realize that it is an idea that has form and substance and rationale and argument. They probably never advocated the idea to anybody, but they've embraced it. But they really don't know what it is. For most people, it's not in their vocabulary. They don't know the name of it. They don't know what it is they believe. And what I'm going to do is give it a name. Well, it already has a name, of course. And by the time I'm through with this presentation, you'll probably be tired of hearing it because I'm going to use it over and over again. But let's go with the first things first. Let's tackle the idea X in the sense of the results of it. It's the source of problems that need to be fixed, so let's take a few moments to examine at least two of those areas, and then we'll move on to the idea behind them. Now, there are many areas or problems I could add to this list, of course, but the sponsor has asked me to focus on just two of them. One is our banking system, a Federal Reserve System in this country, monetary issues, and the other is the income tax. Normally, you wouldn't put those two things together. I'm glad they did because, as you'll see shortly, there is a very strong connection between them. And so I'm going to talk about those two things first. That means that what I'm going to tell you about the Federal Reserve System is going to be a highly truncated version of my longer presentation on that topic. Now, you're probably thinking, whew, thank goodness for that. But how many of you, by the way, have heard a recording of my original presentation on the Federal Reserve called, oh, you've all heard it? Well, good. Well, for those who haven't heard it, you'll see it's featured in that little piece of paper that we send out. We're literally giving it away free for anybody that hasn't had a chance to get hold of a copy of my book, The Federal Reserve System, on the Federal Reserve System. But anyway, it's a 90-minute presentation, and there's a lot of material in there, and I'm not going to be able to but just touch on a few small items from that presentation. If you want the whole story, of course, you'll get it in that lecture and then the 600-page doorstop, sometimes referred to as a book, on the Federal Reserve, and it's all there. And you can get it from our website, which is realityzone.com. Now, to understand, I think, to best understand what's happening in the field of money and with our banking system, we need to understand how it all began. And so I'd like to take a moment and just refresh your memory, for those of you who already know this, memory of how the Federal Reserve came into being. And I think if we understand that, then we have the foundation for understanding almost everything that has happened since then, and certainly all of the confusing events of the day that we read in our daily newspapers. Now, it all started in 1910. It started on a highly secret meeting that took place on an island off the coast of Georgia. The island was called Jekyll Island. And that's the reason, of course, for the title of the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Some people think that, it's a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that, but it's really not. It's a serious story about banking and money. And Jekyll Island in 1910 was privately owned. It was an island that was owned by some rather well-known super wealthy people like J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, and families of that category. It was a resort island. It was on that island that their families went to spend the cold winter months, to get out of New York, travel down to Georgia. And that, believe it or not, is where the Federal Reserve System was created. And the reason for that, the reason they chose that location is because the people that put it together, and I'll give you their names in a moment, did not want publicity. They wanted this to be truly secret. In fact, for many years thereafter, the men that went to this meeting on Jekyll Island, if they were asked, "Did you go to a meeting on Jekyll Island?" And, "Oh, no, who told you that?" They didn't use the phrase in those days, but if they had, they would have said, "What is some kind of a conspiracy theory?" No, they denied it completely. It wasn't until many years after the Federal Reserve System was enacted into law and became almost revered as a great American institution by the American people. Only then did these men begin to talk openly about this journey and what they did there, who was there, what they talked about, and so forth. But anyway, here in a nutshell is the story. It was late in November 1910, when Senator Nelson Aldrich sent his private railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station. A private railroad car in 1910 was a big deal, sort of like having your own Boeing 707 today, And so anyway, he had one. You can imagine he didn't earn his money to pay for that on a senator's salary. He was a very wealthy person, a big name investor, he was a business associate with the Rockefellers and all of that. And so he had a private railroad car, that's the point. And he invited 5 other men to join him that evening at the New Jersey Railroad Station and get on board the train. They were told when they arrived at the station to avoid being seen together. They were to come one at a time. They were told that if they should avoid, if they should see any newspaper reporters, they should avoid them at all costs, if possible. See, in those days, the best way to get an interview with some celebrity or a politician was to catch them on the way to and from the train station. This is before the days of air travel. And so everybody moving in and out of New York had to go through this train station, and they had the paparazzis there, and they were always hanging out in the railroad station. And so the instructions were very significant. Avoid these reporters at all costs. One of the men carried a shotgun with him in a big black case. So in case he had been stopped by a newspaper reporter, he was prepared to tell them that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out from his son, who wrote about this in later years, and it also showed up in one of his biographies, that this man never fired a gun in his life. And this was not his shotgun. It was borrowed from a friend, and it was merely part of the necessary deception to throw off the scent any of the hound dogs that might be sniffing for a story. When they got on board the private railroad car, they were told, when talking to each other, to use first names only. Nix on the last names. And two of them even abandoned their first names and used code names in talking to each other in the privacy of the railroad car. One of the men wrote about this event in later years, and he explained that the reason for that was they were concerned that the servants on board the train would find out or figure out from the conversation who all these people were. Well, of course, the servants knew who Senator Aldrich was, but they didn't know the others. And it was the names of all of these people together that if they had talked about it and indirectly had this word gotten out, why the purpose of this meeting would have been completely subverted. Well, they traveled for 2 nights and a day southward till they arrived at Brunswick, Georgia. There they got off the train early of the second morning, and they were taken to the dock. It was right there in the inland straits. And they were taken by ferry boat across the strait to the island, and from there they went to this beautiful clubhouse. They called this place the Jekyll Island Club. And many of the members had their beautiful estates there. They called them cottages, but they were more like mansions. You can visit them today, by the way. You don't have to take a ferry boat. They now have a bridge. But you can visit some of those very beautiful estates and get a pretty good idea of how the very wealthy lived back in 1910, turn of the last century. But the activities, all the social activities of this group took place in the clubhouse, and that too is still standing. It's been taken over by the Marriott hotels, and I've stayed there a couple of times. Very nice accommodations, very good food, and you can just get a sense of the history of that period by walking through the halls and looking at the rooms and the decorations and so forth. Very, very elegant. The clubhouse was the scene of the meeting. And they sat around a table in that clubhouse for a week. And day by day, they hammered out all of the intricate details of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. And if you visit that building today, you can see that room. If you're heading out the back door, just before you exit the building, turn to your left and you'll see a door with a brass plaque on it. And it says Federal Reserve Room, of all things, because that's where the Federal Reserve was created. If you go inside, you see the pictures of these men on the fireplace, on the wall. And if you really get interested in all this history, you can visit the archives of the museum there, and some very nice ladies who maintain all of the files and pictures would be happy to share with you, as they shared with me, photographs, handwritten notes, newspaper articles, all of these sorts of things. They're very glad to share any of this history with you. And the point I'm trying to make is that although the story I am telling is not widely known, you certainly will not find it in any of the major textbooks on the Federal Reserve or banking. Nevertheless, it's not a mystery. It's definitely documented. It's part of the fabric of our history, and you can find most of it in any well-stocked public library. And most of it, though, has come forth after the Federal Reserve was created, because at that time, they did not want anyone to know that they were doing this thing. Well, when they were done, they came back and they took the train back to New York, and then these people disappeared back into the environs of Wall Street. Well, let me tell you who these people were. This is the critical part. You already heard the name Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was the fellow with the private railroad car. In government, he was chairman of the National Monetary Commission. That was the committee of Congress that was given the task of proposing legislation supposedly to bring about reform in banking. You see, in those days, there was a great deal of concern on the part of the American people about this concentration of economic power into the hands of a few large Wall Street banks, insurance companies, and investment firms. They knew that the whole artery of the American economy was sort of surrounded by the hands of these few firms, and they wanted legislation to control that so that the people would be protected against a monopoly in the marketplace. And this was a very popular political movement at the time. The slogan for this was break the grip of the money trust. That is a phrase I ran across many times as I was doing research. In those days, we didn't have the internet, so I would go down to the Los Angeles Public Library dutifully Monday through Thursday for weeks on end and sit in front of those machines, you know, those film machines, and turn the crank, microfilm, and you could just see the newspapers roar past you. It's just like seeing a science fiction movie in which the time machine was moving you through, you know, years and years of time in a few seconds. And there it was, all moving quickly. And every once in a while, my eye would catch something about a headline that would say, the money trust. And that was a theme that showed up over and over again. Letters to the editor, newspaper articles, always about how to break the grip of the money trust. And so the purpose of this Aldrich Committee, or the National Monetary Commission, was to come up with legislation to satisfy the public demand to break the grip of the money trust. Now, Aldrich was the head of that committee. He was also father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., I should say, Jr. That means that he was the grandfather to our Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller. If you remember, Nelson's middle name was Aldrich, in recognition of his famous grandfather. Okay, I could go on, but anyway, that was the first one. The second man on board the train was Abraham Piatt Andrew. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at that time, which doesn't really tell you much about him or about his power, because he was really a banker. He came from banking circles, pretty much the way it's always been. If you notice, the men who are appointed to be Secretary of the Treasurer, I should say, Treasury, who are they? They're bankers, aren't they? They don't come from the ranks of common people. They're all bankers. They come representing indirectly their close ties to the banking industry, and Abraham Piatt Andrew certainly was no exception. He later became a congressman. If you read the book, you'll find he played a major role in there's a chapter there on a major play in Moscow, Mission in Moscow. He was one of those representatives of these Wall Street firms that went to Moscow during the Bolshevik Revolution, posing as Red Cross officers. They actually had literally bought the New York branch of the Red Cross. They made large donations to it, and in return for that, they were given positions on the board of directors, and they dominated that. And so then these key people went as officers of the Red Cross, wearing khaki uniforms, looking like military uniforms, and Red Cross on their arms. And I have a picture in the book of one of this group standing there next to an ambulance, a Red Cross ambulance, and it was a fraud, all of it, because these were all bankers, and they were there specifically to funnel money into the various revolutionary groups to make sure that no matter who won the revolution in Russia, they would have an inside track. And they gave most of their money, of course, to the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks opened arms to them after the success of the revolution. That's sort of an aside. I didn't mean to get into it, but Abraham Piatt Andrew was an important person at many, many different levels, and that just happens to be one of them. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, one of the most powerful banks at that time, and he represented the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davison was there, the senior partner of J.P. Morgan and Company. Benjamin Strong was there. He was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, and he later became the first acting head of the Federal Reserve System. Paul Warburg was there, last but certainly not least. He's considered by many people to be the most influential person in that group. He was a full partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a naturalized American citizen, was born in Germany, and as such, here in the United States, he represented the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And all throughout his business career, and especially in the Federal Reserve, he maintained a very close liaison with his brother Max Warburg, who was head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Very, very powerful person, and those of you who are Little Orphan Annie fans will recognize the caricature of Daddy Warbucks. You ever notice Daddy Warbucks and Warburg sort of sound a little bit alike? And if you hold up a caricature of Daddy Warbucks next to a photograph of Daddy Warburg, you'll see that they look exactly alike. And in fact, they were. Daddy Warbucks was modeled after Warburg, and most readers of comic strips in those days were well aware of that fact. And it's interesting to me how much history is right before our eyes sometimes, and we don't even know it, because a lot of those characters wound up in common culture symbols, like the game of Monopoly. You know, that little fat capitalist sitting on the bag of money with his black stogie and his... That's J.P. Morgan. Take a look at him. Everybody knew that was Morgan. Anyway, none of that is important to our story, but it's just kind of a flavorful little side trip. These are the men that traveled in that private railroad car and spent a week on Jekyll Island and literally drafted the Federal Reserve Act. According to analysts at the time, talking about these people, not necessarily as travelers to Jekyll Island for this purpose, but this group. In the newspapers of the time, they referred to this group as holding, directly or indirectly, 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. That's a lot of wealth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if that isn't the money trust, what is it? So why the secrecy becomes very clear. In fact, one of the participants says it right in plain English. Vanderlip himself, in later years, published an article in the Saturday Evening Post, February 9, 1935. And in that article he said, quote, if we were to be exposed publicly, or if it were to be exposed publicly, that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Obviously, the banking trust, I mean, this was the money trust writing a bill to control the money trust. So the whole fraud would have been out in the open, and that is basically the reason for such great secrecy. There's something else to be learned from this group. If you think for a moment, isn't it strange that here these powerful financial firms were coming together and agreeing on something, because heretofore they were competitors, and they continued to appear to be competitors. And it happens that this occurred precisely at the time in history when a lot of historians, they describe this period at the turn of the last century as the dawning of the cartel, or the dawning of monopoly. I've seen that phrase used. And it simply means that at that period of time, there's about a 20 to 30 year window when the United States was going through a very important transition from the old, outdated concept of free enterprise competition, sometimes referred to as cutthroat competition, to a period of cooperation, cartel, and monopoly. In other words, the elimination of competition. John D. Rockefeller phrased it pretty well. He's quoted in two of his biographies. His biographers quote him as saying, "Competition is a sin." He was, on the surface at least, appeared to be a very religious man, and he equated competition in the marketplace with sin. Now that he was on top of the heap and he didn't want any competition, but while he was climbing to the top of the heap, competition was just fine, thank you. But now when these people get to the top, they don't want competition anymore, they start forming cartels and monopolies. And this was happening at a great pace throughout industry at that time. And ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what happened on Jekyll Island. These were the great financial titans of the day. They had been battling each other for dominance in the money markets of the world, blood all over the battlefield in Paris and London and New York. And all of a sudden, they're sitting around this table on Jekyll Island kind of eyeing each other and saying, well, okay, guys, we aren't going to be able to knock each other out of the ring, so let's just get used to that idea. We'll share this power, but let's make sure nobody else comes in, okay? The American people want the banking industry regulated, so let's regulate it for them. Let's regulate it to our plan, our liking. Instead of controlling our power, let's enhance our power with these regulations. Let's eliminate competition. Let's control the competition at least, so that we can not only maintain but enhance our dominant position in the marketplace. That is exactly what happened on Jekyll Island, and once that idea jumps from the printed history pages into your head, and you realize that's what the Federal Reserve System is, it's not a government agency at all. It's a cartel. Then you've learned about 87.2% of everything you need to know about the Federal Reserve System. It's a cartel, ladies and gentlemen. And once you get that idea, you understand what it's doing. What does a cartel do? Does it serve the American people? No. Cartels are formed for one thing, and that's to advance the members of the cartel. Period. Now, they have to go through the appearance of doing good works, otherwise they wouldn't be tolerated as they are tolerated. You know, if the chairman of the Federal Reserve were to be called before a committee of Congress and asked, what are you guys doing? You just raised those interest rates last week and they were high enough. They were too high as it was. And if the chairman said, well, we talked it over among ourselves and we figured we could squeeze another 0.5% out of the American people and they wouldn't know, we decided to do it. That wouldn't go over too good. So they have to say, well, we want to stimulate the economy. We want to provide jobs. We want to help you folks because we care about America. That's what they say. And people go, oh, good men. Good men. See? And it's a fraud. And it's all very clear when you see how it was formulated in the beginning. So it's a cartel. I could go on more about that, but we have many other topics to cover, so let's close that chapter and move on. What did we get? Well, we know, there's something I have to throw in here. I hope I don't run too long on this, but how did they create money? Is anybody interested in that topic? I hope so, because you're going to get it anyway. The idea of creation of money doesn't cross most people's minds. At least it didn't cross mine until many, many years down this path. I just assumed, well, they take care of that somehow. Very wise and dependable people, reliable people, ethical people take care of that. And I don't need to know about it. Well, I did need to know about it, although I didn't know that I needed to know about it. I'm going to tell you how it works. I call it the Mandrake mechanism. Because when I was a boy, back in the 1940s, there was a comic book character by the name of Mandrake the Magician. And he was quite a guy, had this big black cape, and he could wave the cape around and voila, produce something out of thin air. And there it would be. Or he could wave it again and it's gone, completely gone. He could materialize and dematerialize things. I thought, boy, that's what goes on at the Federal Reserve System in the form of money. They materialize it and then they dematerialize it. So I call it the Mandrake mechanism. I'll try and make this short. It consists of two parts. The first part is the one that most people get all in a snit and a dither about when they discover it, and that is that the Federal Reserve creates money out of nothing to loan to the federal government. That's all. Very simple thing. They're authorized by this Federal Reserve Act that really was drafted on Jekyll Island. You see, what they did is they took their cartel agreement and they took it to Washington, and they got the eraser and they said, this isn't going to go. The word cartel agreement, no, they don't like it. Erase that. They wrote in Federal Reserve Act. That was about the only difference. And so the dum-dums in Washington said, oh, it's an act. Oh, we're going to pass it into law. So they passed a cartel agreement into law, thinking that they were regulating the banks. So now it's law. That means if you or I violate any of the terms of this private cartel agreement, we go to jail. And so we think, well, who can put us in jail? Only the government can do that. So therefore, this must be an agency of the federal government. It's not. It just means that these smart bankers got the dumb politicians to sign this into law, and so now they got the government to enforce their cartel agreement. Okay? That's the basis of it. So the banks insisted that they be allowed to create money out of nothing, and in order to get the government sort of enthusiastic about it, they said, look guys, we'll create this money for you, for the government. You don't have to go tax people anymore if you don't want to. I'll be talking about that later when we come to the income tax portion of this. But they basically said, you don't need taxes. We'll just make it out of nothing. And you'll have unlimited amounts of money. Oh, well, of course, you have to pay a little interest on it to us, but that's okay. We'll only spend what we need to operate our cartel, and whatever's left over we'll give back to you and give it back to the people, we should say, and everybody will be happy because, you see, we're not making a profit on it. So people do like that idea. So, well, you see, the Federal Reserve is not making any money. They only run their tight ship called the Federal Reserve. There's no, nothing illegal going on there. There are no fat expense accounts or anything like that, I'm sure. But we won't audit it, by the way, but whatever they say is they spent, well, we'll just pay it. And then everything left over goes back to the American people. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not where the action is. It's the other part that people don't focus on. You see, the money that they create for the federal government eventually winds up in somebody's pocket. Let's say it winds up in the pocket of the postman that delivers your mail. And he deposits that into his checking account. And that's in a commercial bank down the street. Now it's out of the government cycle and it's into the private banking cycle. And that's where the action really is. People don't look at that generally. Now the local bank, if the local banker gets a $1,000 deposit from the postman, did you know he can loan up to $9,000 to you and still have $1,000 in reserve? The original $1,000 is called a reserve, and the Federal Reserve Act or cartel agreement says commercial banks can take their reserves and multiply them by 10 to 1 and loan out what they just created by that X factor. So they create money out of nothing and loan it to you and me at interest. Interest on nothing. Not too bad. I wish I had a checkbook like that. But of course, if I tried to do that, they'd throw me in prison. But they do it all the time, and that's called commercial banking. And that, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is the Mandrake mechanism. And it's the way most of the money in the world now is created. All of it out of nothing, but it usually starts by creating money for the government The government puts it then into the economy and pays for all of the things it must pay for, all of its employees, its military, benefits, whatever they need to spend to buy votes or buy the loyalty of some foreign dictator or whatever. That makes no difference. They don't have to worry about how much it costs, really, because the Federal Reserve is obligated to create any amount that it needs and go through this motion of lending it to them, knowing that most of it is going to be returned. The interest is going to be returned to them anyway, so it's just a trick. If you've ever wondered how, in this day and age today, how Congress these guys can wave their hands and they'll vote for something that costs, $70 trillion or some unthinkable number. Nobody asks where are we going to get the money because they don't need to. They know where the money is going to come from. It comes from the Federal Reserve. They will create it out of nothing. Now, what's the effect of all that? The effect, in a nutshell, is inflation. You keep pumping more and more money into the economy in this fashion, and the value of all of those monetary units starts to lose its purchasing power. It's as simple as that. Inflation is the result of it. We have already experienced since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was passed into law, the purchasing power of the American dollar has lost over 97% of its value. 97, it's essentially wiped out. And the process is continuing. And they just expect to do this so that in every generation, a third of whatever people have saved is taken away. And through 3 generations, a person's lifetime or thereabouts, it's all gone. But who cares? They're dying anyway. And the young people don't know any difference. They're sort of born into the new system. And it's a perpetual motion machine that they've created of constantly taking the wealth of the average person. Inflation is a tax. It's not recognized generally as a tax, but it's a real tax. It has no deductions, has no exemptions, and it affects the people who can least afford to pay it the most. So that's the consequence of the Mandrake mechanism, and that in a nutshell is the problem with the Federal Reserve System, because it is the engine for making all of this happen. Now you know that one of the reasons, well, you don't know that one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve was created was to bail out the banks when they inevitably come apart. But that was one of the reasons, and they talked about it. How would they pass on their losses to the taxpayers in such a way as to make it seem like they were saving the country? They talked about that. But now, what I started to say is, you know how that has played out today, because that's exactly what they're doing. They say, well, we can't let America fall. If one of these big banks should fall, they're too big to fail, because if they should fail, America will fail. Right? That's the story. Too big to fail, too big to jail. Because America would fall. And so that's the game that they play. But now, and the reason I mention this, is that as of right now, we're living through this little piece of history right now. Earlier this month, we saw for the first time in the country of Cyprus where that model was changed, where they no longer bailed out the banks with taxpayer money and just created it and gave it to the banks. They have a new method now. It's called not the bailout, but the bail-in. That's what they call it. And the bail-in means they don't take it from the taxpayers at large, they'll take it from the poor people that have put their money in the banks. They'll take it from the depositors and just steal it from them. But you can be sure they're going to get it from somebody, and it's not going to be the banks or the bankers. Some of it is being taken by the stockholders, but most of it being taken from the depositors. We'll see how that plays out. If they think they've had troubles with riots in the street and so forth up until now. See, most people don't realize that their money's being taken through inflation. They haven't figured that out yet. They know that they're losing purchasing power, but that what they don't know is that somebody's getting it. Once they figure out who is getting their lost purchasing power, they're going to be mad. But they haven't figured it out yet. But it's real easy to figure out when somebody comes in and takes money out of your savings account and says, well, too bad, but the bank needs it. Thank you. They can see who got that money. So this is a little more of a direct connection, and I expect to see a little more public unrest, shall we call it, than we have seen in the past. But nevertheless, that is the new model. The reason I know it's the new model, and we're going to see more of it, is because it was all spelled out last year. Toward the end of 2012, there was a paper, a white paper produced jointly by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation here in the States, the Bank of England, and the BIS, which is the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, sort of the fraternity of all of the central banks of the world, including the Federal Reserve. And they said, basically, in the future, we will take deposits rather than have taxpayer bailouts. They said, this is the way we're going to do it from now on. And so it happened a few months later, the first bank that needed bailing out was Cyprus. And sure enough, that's what they did. So we know this is the new model. And that simply means, ladies and gentlemen, that it is coming to a bank near you. And if you have your money, a lot of your money in that bank, don't say you haven't been forewarned. Okay. Now let's turn finally to the second item that I've been asked to address, and that's the income tax. Time really prevents me from a really deep analysis of this topic, but I can't continue without at least mentioning that the income tax was sponsored by exactly the same people, exactly the same people who sponsored the Federal Reserve System. And in the same year. It was like a left foot and a right foot on the same robot. Why would that be? Well, you see, they have bigger things in mind than just raising money. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. What else is accomplished by the income tax? One of the things that is accomplished is the preservation of wealth in the hands of the very wealthy and politically favored class. It was sold to the American people as a means of punishing the rich, getting the rich people to pay instead of the poor people. Americans are not too perceptive about con games. They fell for it, you know. They were filled with envy and resentment on the parts of these wealthy people. Some of them were not very nice people. They were nasty, bad personalities. They did bad things. They didn't have good publicity in the press, and people were happy to see these bad, wealthy people pay. So that's how it was sold. But in reality, the whole design, and the reason that the super wealthy actually promoted it, think about that. These are the wealthiest people in the world promoting an income tax to take money from the rich? What? No. The reason they promoted it is because they knew that the mechanism could be activated in such a way that they could protect their own estates and their own fortunes through something called the tax-exempt foundation. And so all of these people were very quick to put their big assets into so-called publicly held corporations, but not publicly held at all. The boards of directors were loaded with their cronies, their family members, their employees, people who were loyal to them. And so even though these people, the wealthy people, no longer technically owned their assets, they had total access to them. They could do exactly what they wanted to with them. You know, if you want a limousine, do you care whether you have paid for it and bought it, and you're paying the salary of the chauffeur to come pick you up? Or do you care if you can just pick up the phone and say, yes, Mr. President of the Tax-Exempt Foundation that I just created, this is your master speaking. Would you please send over a limousine that the foundation has and a driver? Yes, sir. It's right over. See, if you have access to property, do you care if you've got a piece of paper that says you own it? No, you don't. The only value of ownership is having the right to access, unlimited access to something. So these guys figured that out a long time ago. They protected their wealth, and it wasn't taken by inheritance taxes because
A foundation never dies. You may die, and then you've got an inheritance problem. But if you give it to a family foundation, foundation never dies, and your family can benefit from that forever and ever and ever, and no taxes off the top. So they had that all figured out. While it was being sold to the Americans as a means of punishing the rich, it was a means of protecting the rich. That's the second point I want to just point out. And of course we have the tax loopholes, which everyone knows about. But here's the startler. The purpose of the income tax is not to raise revenue. And I'll prove that in a moment. The purpose is to redistribute wealth. It's to redesign society. It's to punish your enemies and reward your friends if you're a politician. If you're a social engineer, it's to redesign society and make things more equitable in your mind. And they talked about that, and they still talk about that. It was 1946 that a fellow by the name of Rummel, his first name was Beardsley Rummel, wrote an article that appeared in the magazine called American Affairs. And he was talking about the income tax. Rummel was chairman of the New York Federal Reserve. He's no small guy. Actually, he was the guy that designed the withholding tax. It used to be that people had to send in their income tax, all the time. That wasn't doing too well. So Rummel said, look, let's pass a law and require all employers to withhold the tax and send it in, and that way we'll get the money. And that was Rummel. Anyway, he's no lightweight. And it was Rummel who wrote this article in the January issue of that magazine. Now, I'll read a line or two from his article to you, but first I want to read a section from the introduction to the article, which was written by the editor of the magazine. And he said, Rummel's thesis is that given control of a central banking system and an inconvertible money is a currency that is not backed by gold or silver, just paper money, inconvertible. A sovereign national government is finally free of money worries and needs no longer levy taxes for the purpose of providing itself with revenue. All taxation, therefore, should be regarded from the point of view of social and economic consequences. End quote. Now, Rummel himself explained it this way, and he obviously was plagiarizing the ideas of Karl Marx in Das Kapital when he wrote, quote, "The purpose of federal taxes is to attain more equality of wealth and of income than would result from economic forces working alone. The taxes which are efficient for this purpose are the progressive individual income tax, the progressive estate tax, and the gift tax. What these taxes should be depends on public policy with respect to the distribution of wealth and income. These taxes should be defended and attacked in terms of their effect on the character of American life, not as revenue measures." End quote. Now, there is a very important aspect of our taxing system that you seldom hear people talking about. Okay? And that's about where I'm going to leave it as in terms of my discussion of taxes, because we still have that third part coming up, and I don't want to shortchange that. But these men had it figured out from the very beginning that the way to raise revenue was through inflation, and the way to control society was through taxation. Now, we come finally to a question, a very interesting question, I think. Why do we have an income tax that redistributes wealth? Because most Americans want it. Why do we have a banking cartel that plunders taxpayers? Because most Americans want it. They want it because they have been told, and they firmly believe, that somehow this is in their own best interest, that somehow this is in the interest of society. It is for the greater good. And with that, we come finally back to the idea X. Idea X is a mindset. It's a standard of ethics. It's a motive of action that drives most people around the world today. It has conquered, literally conquered the modern world in about 200 years is how long it's taken for that idea to spread and conquer. And the name of that idea X is collectivism. It's a word which many people have not heard. Some people have heard it, they're not quite sure what it means. They confuse collectivism with the concept of collective action. Just because we do something collectively, isn't that collectivism? No, it's not. The people who have been the greatest champions of collectivism have written books about it. They've given lectures on it. They're very clear in their mind as to what collectivism means. And so I'd like to discuss that meaning with you now. In the modern world, we have a lot of debates between people over ideas or ideologies. We have what appears to be the left versus the right. We have the Nazis versus the communists, the socialists versus the capitalists, the Republicans versus the Democrats, the neocons versus something else. There are so many names floating around, you can't keep up with them. Now we have the progressives. Yeah, now what we used to be liberals, now progressive. Oh, and the words are constantly changing. And people argue and argue over what are you? Are you a right-winger or a left-winger? And they haven't the foggiest idea, really, if you challenge them of what any of it means. Ask them to define what they mean, and it stops pretty soon. I contend, ladies and gentlemen, that there are only two words that are meaningful in this debate, at least in our society. You go in other parts of the world, you may find theocracies, but in our part of the world, the Western world in particular, there are only two words that really apply. And that is the contest between collectivism on the one hand and individualism on the other hand. Kind of boring sounding words, but we better get used to what they mean because they're at the heart of all of these problems I've been talking about and many, many, many more. Let's talk about some of the differences. I've been following this and tracking it like a hungry hunter for years and years. And I have discovered that there are approximately 5, depending where you draw the line, but there are 5 meaningful areas of debate or difference of opinion between collectivists and individualists. The first area has to do with the origin of human rights. A collectivist believes that human rights are derived from the state. They are granted by the state. And therefore, if the state can grant you a right, it has the authority to take it away. This is the ideology of all collectivist systems, whether they be Nazi, communist, socialist, even some people calling themselves Americanists believe that the state is the origin of your rights. The era that they wrote it, unalienable was what we would call inalienable today. In other words, they said the rights were God-given, didn't they? But whether you say they're God-given or not, we all agree that they are intrinsic. It's the difference between software and hardware. A computer is hardware. You add to the computer the software. The individualist believes that human rights are hardware. The collectivist says, no, they're software. They're added to the individual after he's born, and they're added by the state. Very important distinction. And you would be surprised if you were to query your favorite elected leader in America today, what his views or her views are on the origin of human rights on this topic, you'd be surprised how many people would say, well, they come from the state. The United Nations is a perfect example. If you read their draft covenant on human rights, everybody's so enamored with the United Nations Covenant on Human Rights because it lists all these rights. Of course, it takes them away, too. By the way, I'll take just a moment on that. I have a whole lecture on this topic, but I got to give you this. This tidbit is too good to let go by. You know, they say, the United Nations says, and it's modeled after the Soviet Constitution, by the way, which said, all men have a right to freedom of speech, except as may be provided by law. And we got the law. That's the trick right there. The United Nations Draft Covenant on Human Rights is loaded with all of these wonderful rights: freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, right to religion, right to a job, right to health care, right to everything except as provided by law. And then they produced a big, thick document. I've forgotten how many pages. I think it was 285 pages, 8.5 by 11 inch, fine print, an instruction manual, a workbook, if you will, on how to design laws specifically to deny rights. How to do it. It's a how-to manual. Oh, well, anyway, I don't want to get off on that, except that this is, the origin of human rights is extremely important, because the United Nations Draft Covenant on Human Rights says, in protecting these rights as provided by the state, and that is a direct quote, therein the United Nations has declared itself firmly on the side of collectivism on point number 1. Point number 2, the supremacy of the group versus the individual. This is really interesting. Collectivists believe that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. I was taught that in school. It sounded good to me. After all, isn't that the basis of democracy? We've come to that word. Democracy, the things that our founding fathers detested. Isn't that the basis of majority rule? The individualist says, no, there's no such thing as a group. What is a group? Can you point to a group? Can you touch a group? No. You can point to a lot of individuals. You can touch individuals. But a group is a word. It's an abstract word. It's an abstraction in the mind. It's a mathematical concept. It's not a real thing. It's a mental abstraction. It doesn't exist outside of the mind. How can you say that something that doesn't even exist has rights that are superior to yours, and you do exist? It's a terrible mistake. And people make it all the time because they're taught to make that mistake. Is the majority really that sacred? What about a lynch mob? There's only one dissenting vote, and he's at the end of the rope. Wait a minute, maybe the majority isn't necessarily, I have to think about this. But now we're getting somewhere. We have to think about this. That's the problem with many people. They don't think about it. It's the difference between a republic and a democracy. When this nation was founded, our founding fathers spoke about democracy, and they said that we don't want it. Read their letters, read the Federalist Papers, read the debates, and they say a democracy is the worst possible form of government. We don't want it. We want a republic. In fact, I have a few quotes here. I can see a couple of raised eyebrows. Republics versus democracy. Where did I find this? Okay. In colonial America, Samuel Adams said, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. End quote. In England, Lord Acton, who you all know, he's famous for saying power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I'll get to him later. It was Lord Acton who said, "The one pervading evil of democracy is the tyranny of the party that succeeds by force or fraud in carrying elections." End quote. In Scotland, a history professor at the University of Edinburgh, his name was Alexander Tyler, wrote, quote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, usually followed by a dictatorship." End quote. All right. So there's a second very important difference between collectivism and individualism. The third one, coercion versus freedom. Collectivists believe in force. Individualists believe in freedom of choice. A collectivist will say, if something is worthwhile, by golly, let's pass a law and force people to do it. Otherwise, they might not make the right choice. I have a good friend. He drives me crazy sometimes. If he sees something he doesn't like somebody tosses a cigarette on the ground, he says, "There ought to be a law." How many times have you heard that? In fact, I suppose I've even said it too, but in jest. No, there oughtn't to be a law at all. Because it's all those little laws. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. First thing you know, you can't even get up in the morning without permission. And piece by piece, we give away our freedom. And besides, how about freedom of choice to do the right thing? Collectivists say seatbelts are a good idea. People can get killed without seatbelts. Therefore, let's pass a law and force everybody to wear seatbelts or fine them heavily or put them in prison. That's done. The individualist says seatbelts are a good idea. People can get killed without seatbelts. I think they should wear seatbelts. Well, I don't think you should put them into prison for not wearing seatbelts. I think what you should do is try and convince them. You should show by your own good example. You might even ask them, would you please put on your seatbelt? But you're not going to punish them and use coercion against them for not doing it. And there's the difference, you see. I was in a place in Florida once giving a talk, and I walked out the door. There in the parking area, there was a big sign. It said, handicap parking, violation fine $100 or something like that. I mean, who wouldn't leave a place for the handicapped open anyway? But even if they did, well, they can burn in hell. That's okay, but why? So I got my camera out and I took it, and I went to Photoshop, or a Corel photo paint is what I use. I got that $100 fine and I eliminated it, and I put in the words, "Thank you." And I published them. I said, which system would you rather live? What community would you rather live under? One that punishes you for not parking in a place, or the one that thanks you for not parking in a place? So there's the difference between individualism and collectivism again. Collectivists will force people to do what they think is right, or they're going to be severely punished. Number 4, equality versus inequality under law. Everybody says, I'm all for equality under the law, but nobody really believes it. If you were to take a look at the laws on the books in the United States and in most counties and cities, you will find that, I'm sure, in excess of 99% of them do not treat people equally under the law. There's always an exception, or this group gets favored position over that group, and in fact, that is the purpose of the law, is to favor one over another, or to punish one over another. That's the whole purpose of most of our laws. The income tax not being the least of them, of course. There's nothing equal about that at all. But anyway, that's a very important distinction between collectivism and individualism. And finally, the number 5 on the list has to do with the proper role of government. And this is sort of a catch-all, because sometimes there are gray areas and you don't know, well, how do you decide this one? We want to give people freedom of action, but we also want to protect their life, liberty, and property. And so anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that the proper function of government under collectivism is to be positive, to be forceful, to be the leader, to be the organizer, the generator of prosperity, the protector of prosperity, and the educator, to do all of the positive things that people want done. Everything's positive. They'll create it and lead it and organize it. And of course regulate it to do that. That's the key, because in order to do all of these positive things, you must regulate. And there goes your freedom. The individualist says, no. The proper function of government is to do only that which individuals can do without government. Because government gets its power from the people, supposedly. Isn't that the idea? The consent of the governed. We grant the government all of its powers. If not, where does it get its power if not from us? So how can we give the government the power to do something that we ourselves cannot do? We can't, logically. But yet collectivists say that you can. They could say, once you create the collectives, create the state, now it has powers of its own that it derives from somewhere, and it can just do it. Now, you yourself cannot do it. What can an individual use coercion logically for? If I may end a sentence, a preposition with there. Well, you can use coercion. You can harm your fellow human being. You may even take his life for only three things, individualists believe. And that is in the defense of your own life, liberty, and property. That's it. Nothing more. Now, you can argue about the fuzzy edges of some of those topics, true. But the concept is clear. The moral use of violence against your fellow human beings is limited to the defensive act, not the aggressive act. You cannot use violence against your neighbor because you want him to send his children to church, or you don't want him to open up his shop on Sunday, or because you want him to wear red underwear, or whatever it is. The only thing you can use violence for is to protect yourself and your family or a friend, to protect someone, their life, their liberty, and their property. So the essence of this point is that the proper function of the state is negative, not positive. And once we get that clear in mind, so many issues of the day get resolved so quickly. It's just amazing. And God, why didn't I get onto this earlier? So now the Federal Reserve System was doomed to fail from the very beginning. It was doomed to fail as a guardian of the economy because that was never its real purpose in the beginning either. It wasn't formed to guard the economy. The purpose is to protect the banks and to generate funding for the government that is independent of taxation. The income tax was doomed to fail from the beginning as a fair distribution of the cost of government because that was never its purpose either. Its purpose is not to raise revenue, but to redistribute wealth and engineer a collectivist society. That's its whole purpose. So collectivism reigns supreme in Washington today. In fact, most of our cities, everywhere you turn, it reigns supreme because most Americans approve of it. They think it's a good thing. They want government to solve all their problems. They turn to government for this solution and that solution. It makes no difference if the last government failed. Give it more money. Hire more people. Get more soldiers, more police. More jails, more rules, more regulation. That'll fix it. And of course, that's the very disease that's destroying it in the first place. Americans today want government control over every aspect of their lives. And how do we know that? Is because they vote for the candidates that promise to give them that. Americans like that idea because they don't realize that there is a price to pay. They don't want to pay the price. If you told them what the price is, they'd probably say, I don't believe that. So we're suffering from a lack of information, aren't we? A lack of education, political awareness. We're living in a nation of, what would you call it? Political, any good word coming along? Naivety? Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Ignorance. We is ignorant. We need an education in the basic reality of politics. The people who are in that field, the professional politicians and the professional bankers, are students of it. They play the voters like a delicate violin. They know exactly what chords to strike, what words to use, what surveys to conduct, what speeches, what promises they have to make. It's a game. And we think it's for real. So this is my message today, ladies and gentlemen. Not a very nice message, but that's how I see it. And what do you call this collectivism? Well, some people call it communism. Some people call it socialism. Some people call it fascism. You hear all those words floating around. And it is all of those because what it really is, underneath it, is collectivism. Those are merely variants of different forms of collectivism. Unfortunately, the word Americanism is being gradually subverted to the point where it too is synonymous with collectivism. Well, now, I guess it's come finally time to kind of wrap this up. And I come to the question, is it possible to slay the creature and the IRS and all of its siblings? Is it possible to restore the republic? And I perhaps skipped over that part when I was talking about republics and democracies, but we did have a republic. We do now live in a democracy. But originally it was a republic, and to define that in the terms that I'm using it anyway, a republic was merely a democracy with limits. Limits on the power of the majority. The majorities can do this, this, and this, but nothing more. The whole Bill of Rights is that Congress shall pass no law restricting the right of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, ... Congress shall pass no law, which means the majority shall not impose its will on the minority in these areas. It's all negative, isn't it? The whole Bill of Rights is the implementation of that negative quality of government that I was talking about. Not except as may be provided for by law, but no law. Big difference. Can we restore the republic? And I think we can, absolutely. But it's not going to be easy. But it can be done, so we should take joy in that. It can be done through Congress, of course, but wait a minute. That means getting rid of a lot of people there. But now, when we talk about getting rid of people, is it the people themselves? Is it because, yeah, he's got it right there. He's pointing to his head. He's way ahead of me. It's not just because they're bad men, or because they're corrupt, or because they're Republicans or Democrats or something else. It's because of what they believe. It's what's in their heads. It's their ideas. And what good is it to throw the rascals out if you just bring in more rascals with the same idea X? And that's what we've been doing. We change Rascal Party A to Rascal Party B, but they all carry the same idea X. So no wonder we're not making much progress. So that's my message, ladies and gentlemen. It has nothing to do with the men or the parties. It has to do with the system that we have allowed to be created, the system of collectivism, and that is our enemy. I'd like to close with a couple of interesting, let's see, how much time do I have? How am I doing? I'm all right. This, I think you might find a little stimulating. Why is it that governments always evolve into criminal syndicates? Did you ever think about that? I used to think, well, America was the exception because we had the Constitution. Well, the Constitution was a barrier, but it was not an insurmountable barrier. And now it's been subverted for the most part, still there, hanging in by a few threads. Let's hope we can restore it. But all governments, including our own now, have a tendency to evolve into criminal syndicates. I don't care whether you're a local hometown, sometimes the smaller communities are easier to see. If the speed traps and the corrupt judge and the mayor and they're all on the take, and everybody knows it, but you can't do anything about it because the sheriff will come by and visit you in the middle of the night. Crime syndicates. Why? It's very easy to understand. It's because of the system. We expect government to be collectivist in nature. We expect government to do everything. We expect government to be powerful, and we are always trying to give it more and more and more power. And as Acton said, power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And here we can hardly wait to make our governments absolutely powerful. Is anybody surprised that they become absolutely corrupted? When you have power over other human beings legalized, it becomes a magnet for the criminal class. They think, why am I out here outside of government fighting the government when I can get elected or appointed and I can do much worse things, and I'm the guy that decides who goes to jail? Duh. It's a magnet for the criminal class. The criminal segment is drawn to powerful government. And so if we ever hope to change this, we've got to change the magnet, get rid of that magnet. We've got to get at the core of the problem, which is the concentration of power. Until we do that, we're just giving speeches. I would like to close by making a case for something called a protectorate. I never thought in the early days when I was learning about the Constitution that I would ever find anything serious to say as a critique of the Constitution. And I still more or less feel that way. I think the Constitution, although it wasn't perfect, was a great beta model. It was the first document ever written of its kind, where men who had the possibility of being given the power of a kingship, of royalty. They'd won the American Revolution, and frankly, the colonists wanted George Washington to be another King George. They expected it, because that's all they knew. Royalty, monarchy. Boy, the odds were against the fact that here were this small gathering of people in Pennsylvania, each of whom could have had a plush position in the new monarchy, saying, nope, that's not what we want. We do not want monarchies. We want a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We want the people to be sovereign. You know all the rest. We've got the Bill of Rights and all these concepts. But they made a mistake, and I realize that now. They used the wrong word. They used the word government, because that's the word that was on the shelf. That's what you called the state in those days, government. What is the purpose of a government? To govern. Is that what we want? No. I don't want to be governed. And that's not what they created. They were very specific. They didn't create a state that would govern the people. They created a state that would protect the people. And they said that to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens, and that was built into it, but they used the word government. Darn it, a mistake. So ever since then, all of the children in school and the students reading about this, well, what kind of a government do we have? And they lost the debate right there. The word salted the argument. What if the word had been protectorate? Okay, now what is the proper function of a protectorate? Well, there it is, to protect, isn't it? But simply changing a word, I think we could, the next time around when we have to rebuild all of this, if we would use the word protectorate, we would probably be halfway to the goalpost, because it would be automatically stimulating people to think of that negative quality of government instead of the positive quality. So I'd like to close, ladies and gentlemen, by thanking you for your attention on all of this. And if you really are interested in opening or going through some of these doors that I think I may have opened up in your mind, if you want to go through those doors and explore what lies beyond, I invite you to come to a website. I hope you'll remember it. It's an organization I created a few years ago called Freedom Force International. And on the internet you'll find it as freedomforceinternational.org. And you'll see a lot of information on these topics, and I hope you'll explore them and that someday you will become part of our organization. Because if you want to become part of the solution, Freedom Force awaits you. Thank you very much.
Okay, right now we're going to go to question and answer. If you guys have a question for Mr. Griffin, please raise your hand. Also, this white flyer has information. If you guys would like to get a free download of a copy of the lecture today, you're free to do that. There's also a special where for $25 you can get the book and get a copy of the DVD sent to you, autographed copy. So at this time we're going to do a question and answer, and we're going to rotate. One of the members and myself will rotate between questions.
Do you feel that the insiders have changed horses midstream by changing from the communists as our enemy to the Muslims?
Would you restate that? I'm not quite sure I understood the business about communism and Islam.
Well, for so many years, the insiders, the people behind the doors, have used the communists to create our enemy for us to fight. So now, has it been switched over to the Muslims? Of course, I know that the Muslims have been funded by the communists, so comment on that, please.
Yeah. Now I understand the question. Well, it's a tricky one because I think there's some element of, strong element of truth in it, but there are a couple of little tricky parts. First of all, the first part. There's no question that in the 1960s, when I was cutting my teeth on so much of this information, communism was the big enemy, external enemy that we had to worry about. That was the official doctrine of the people who were running the show then, and it's their kids that are running the show now. That was the official doctrine. Now, there's no doubt in my mind as I've matured and gone back over a lot of that history that the threat was exaggerated. But there's also no doubt in my mind that international communism was not something to ignore. It was a real problem, a real threat, and they were aggressively trying to, and still are, by the way, aggressively trying to dominate the world. The world today is divided into two basic camps. There's the Leninist camp, and well, there's not really a good word for our so-called our camp. I call it the Rhodesian camp because it's all the countries that have come under the influence of a secret society that was created by Cecil Rhodes. In the United States, that organization is represented or becomes visible in the form of the Council on Foreign Relations. In England, it's the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And in Scotland and in Canada and so forth, they all have different names, but mostly the world is divided between these two camps. And neither one are advocating the system that we want to live under. They both are collectivist in nature. That's my point. It's what people would call right versus left, but they're both collectivism. So I'm not saying, when I acknowledge that the communist threat was exaggerated in order to generate a lot of hysterical, blind thinking on the part of Americans to do whatever their leaders said to protect us against communism. I'm not saying that that was completely unfounded, because there was some basis to it, but it was exaggerated. I know that. Now, having said that, we come to today's world, and I think the same situation exists. There's no doubt in my mind that there are some groups within the Islamic movement that are really truly jihadists, and they're not nice people. They certainly don't fit in. They wouldn't fit in with this group here. You know, they have other ideas. But I also know that they're in the minority. I also know that they get maximum press coverage whenever they do something, and I also know that they are funded by the CIA. Okay? But they're real. See, that's the important thing. They're real. They don't know that they're being used. These kids strap bombs on themselves. They'll come blow us up if they would. It's a real threat. But the rulers in this country want that threat. They want us to be scared out of our wits, so we'll accept the Patriot Act and all these other things and do what they want us to do. It's a terrible world to live in. And, you know, there are a lot of people... She's got the microphone back there. Yeah.
Help me understand something I've just never been able to get straight in my brain. If I have 10 $100 bills, I got $1,000, I loan it to a friend, they got it, they pay me back with interest, I make some money. How can a bank have 10 $100 bills and loan it out 9 times? I can't figure that out. I don't understand.
Well, if I were a banker, I would say, never mind, my child, you don't need to know. But it's not so simple. First of all, when they loan money, I mean, it's not so complicated. First of all, when they loan money, most of the time it's not $100 bills. It's a keystroke on a computer or an ink blob on a deposit book. So they don't have to print the currency. They just create the money as a concept. It's just digital, you know. So they can create unlimited quantities of that. Now, if you would come to the point where these people in Cyprus have come to, where they want cash, they're no longer content with digits in their checkbook, because the grocery stores won't accept checks and the credit cards don't work and so forth. Now people want paper cash. Now that's when they turn on the printing presses. And they can and would print as much physical money as would be needed for that. But they would simply convert those digital impulses in the computer into currency. In other words, it would be an accounting transfer from one ledger to another. The system carries currency on its books, currency in circulation on its books as an asset. And on the other side, they've got currency not in circulation, and that's not an asset. It's just considered inventory of paper. It's not money yet. But it can be converted into money simply by moving it on the accounting ledger from one side to the other, putting it into circulation, and then purchasing that inventory with digital money. So the books remain balanced, but they simply have moved paper currency from an inventory category, which is a non-monetary nature, into currency, which is a monetary nature. And so when that moves this way, then the digital numbers representing money moves that way, and so it's balanced. It's really simple.
Right here. Would you think, or give me your thoughts, do you think an individual can live in a republic today? And if they can, what would that look like?
I gather that you mean, can an individual sort of opt out of the system and not be affected by this democracy that we live in?
Well, I was using the word individual based on your comparison between collectivism and individualism. So
okay,
I guess maybe that might be what it would look like. I
see. Okay. That's a really good question. What would it look like? Because I've been wanting to find some time so I could write a kind of a sassy novel about, you know, what it would be like under the circumstances. The collectivists throughout history, over the last couple of hundred years, have always written good books, the utopian novels, you know? And they've got a little bit of drama, a little bit of romance, a little bit of adventure, all wrapped into it. But us on the side of freedom, we're kind of boring people. We don't write interesting books. And I would like to do that. But still, I have a pretty good idea in my mind of what it would look like. It would be good. It would be amazingly good, but it would be different, obviously, from what we live in today, because all of us in this room have been raised in this collectivist system, and to one extent or another, we've been indoctrinated into thinking that, you know, how would you get along? How would you take care of the poor people? What would happen to the poor people if you didn't have welfare, for example? And it would be hard for many people to think of a society that existed here in America, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, where there were poor people and they were taken care of by personal charity, in some cases very well taken care of. And institutions, churches also, and other specialized institutions were formed for taking care of the poor. The idea that the only way to have charity is through compulsion is kind of a bizarre concept, but we've been raised with that idea that if you don't force people to take care of their neighbor, they won't do it. And then therefore the neighbor will starve. I don't think that's a correct reading of human nature at all. In fact, my own reading is that if we didn't have this subconscious awareness that, oh, well, there are government agencies I'm contributing to already to take care of this guy, why should I also put a dollar in his cup? You know, all you got to do is go down to City Hall and there's an agency ready. If we didn't have that idea in our mind, I think we would all act in a lot more charitable, personal charitable way than we do now. I use that just as one example. What would it look like? I think it would be a society in which people were raised with the idea that we are responsible, primarily responsible for ourselves and our family and our loved ones. And the family unit would automatically become, again, the center of society, the most important center, or possibly some people would say our churches would be. But the last place you want to be the center of society is the government, because that is subject to all of the corruption that we're talking about. Once you have the power of coercion, when you add that power of coercion to any charitable act, or any beneficial act for that matter, the arts, music, anything, education, once you add the element of compulsion to it, it no longer serves its original function. It may try to look like it is in order to keep the money coming, but all of a sudden other agendas take over and people start fattening their pocketbooks at the expense of the public agenda and so forth. I think government has already, we should know by now, it's the last institution that we should turn to bring about any of these positive things that we seek in society. Someday I'll write that book, or maybe somebody here will. I'd like to read about it. You write it, okay. Hey, whoever's got the mic here.
The Federal Reserve only creates the principal on the money. How does that affect us as debtors when we have to pay back the principal plus the interest?
I believe that is a myth. I read it a lot, and I addressed that in my book, the myth that the money is never created to pay back the interest, and therefore the longer we go, the deeper in the hole we get. And it sounds kind of logical at first, but the answer to that riddle is that labor becomes the basis for money. you can earn money. You can earn the same dollar over and over and over again by cooking the same ham and eggs over and over again every day. You know, if you were a cook, so you could $1 could pay you every day if that's what you charge to cook ham and eggs. You could, and then in the morning you get your dollar for cooking the ham and eggs, and in the afternoon you spent your dollar on a Coca-Cola, and then the guy that got your dollar for the Coca-Cola wants you to cook ham and eggs again in the morning. That same dollar can keep you working for a long time. So it's not just the amount of dollars that are out there, but what those dollars do. How are they moving? What are they doing? It's the velocity of money, as they call it. And I think the best analogy would be this. Let's suppose that you go to the bank and you borrow, let's say, $1,000, and you promise to pay back $1,100 over the course of a year. And now, there's no other money in existence in the world, in the case of our analogy, just to keep it simple. And so for 10 months, and let's say that your loan is a 10-month loan, you got your $1,000, and at the end of each month, you pay back $100. And so you get to the end of the 10th month, and you're out of money, and you still owe $100. Where are you getting? Well, you go to the bank, and you say, I need money. I'm willing to work. And so they say, well, fine. You wash our floors here for this next month, and we'll pay you $100. So you wash the floors, get the $100, pay back your interest, and you've done it. And the money didn't have to be created, it was there. So the answer to the question is, it gets a little complicated, but it's simply the fact that money has a labor value, and you can keep money in motion by working for it. So the bottom line of that analysis is even worse than the original, because it means that you become, in a way, like enslaved to the banks. It's not that you owe them money, but you owe them labor. You say, somewhere down the line, someone has to work for that interest money. So it's labor that we're talking about, not necessarily just numbers.
Well, they gave us numbers.
Yes, on our foreheads, yes.
Ed, can you address something about the 16th Amendment? I've always contended that the income tax is actually unconstitutional because I'm trading my time for money. So it's not an income, it's a barter. Can you address that a little bit as far as, is that the way you look at it as well? For me, an income is when I take this and I mix it with this and then I sell it for a profit. Where me coming to wash your floors is me trading my time and labor for money.
Yes. Well, and a lot of people certainly agree with you that your income for labor is in a different category than your income from an investment. And there is the crux of the argument. In a way, I could probably argue that even that doesn't make a good distinction, that income from an investment is income from previous labor, because you worked in order to get the money that you invested. So I would even be diehard and say that all income is barter. That's what but unfortunately, the courts don't agree with me.
Do you think the Fabian Society is strong in the United States? I believe that Obama belongs to it.
The Fabian Society?
Fabian Society.
The Fabian, you said?
Yes.
Well, the Fabian Society, of course, is an English institution. Its headquarters are in London. Mm-hmm. I've never heard of Obama being a member of it. I
haven't either, but I believe that he is a socialist. The Fabian Society are socialists, so I just believe that he is a member of it. Because he wants
I'm not aware that Obama is a member of it. I'm not sure they would want him.
I'm assuming he is because the direction he wants to take our country.
Oh, well, there are plenty of other organizations that would be happy to sign him up on that. But the Fabian Society is sort of a wing of the British Labour Party. Mm-hmm. And
It started in what, the 1800, early 1800s?
I'm sorry, what?
It started in the early 1800s, didn't it? But I believe
Yes,
that
yes.
it is.
A group of
It does-
intellectuals in Britain, and very powerful, influential, but kind of behind the scenes. Anyway, to answer your question, I don't think that Obama is a member. I've never heard of that, and I don't know why he would want to be.
Well, because he wants to make us a socialist country.
But he's doing a good job of that without being a member of
That's right,
of the
yeah.
organization. I don't know. Maybe I have something to learn. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a criminologist, so I could, I guess, go on at some length about why government is a criminal syndicate and how they're incentivized in any number of ways to rape, rob, and steal, pillage, and plunder. But my particular question for you has to do with this. I mean, look at what government does to our faces every day. That they do to our faces. What are we supposed to think they're doing behind our backs? I mean, and so what my question is I find it extraordinarily fascinating that even people who distrust the media emphatically, a recent Rasmussen poll out indicating trust levels in MSM at all-time lows. Why do you think it is that so many people find it so difficult to believe that powerful, highly visible people in government are not motivated to do extraordinarily heinous things and don't, in many instances, actually do those things? I mean, given what they do to our faces, I find it astonishing that so many people who say they don't trust the mainstream media then turn around and trust the mainstream media on the most important issues and simply refuse to believe that someone who they see on TV every day could do truly terrible things. Thank you.
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? It's obvious that there is a big disconnect between what people say and what they internalize. My mother-in-law is dead, so I can tell this story. She used to sit in the living room and she'd read the newspaper and she'd say, this is a bunch of lies, nothing but lies, lies. I don't believe anything you read in the newspaper. And then she'd find an article and say, listen to this. And then she'd start it. Perfect example, yeah. And I guess we all do that to some extent. And I think the reason we do that is because we have a subconscious desire to believe certain things and a subconscious desire to question certain. We don't want to think ill of our leaders, because if our leaders are really as bad as we suspect they are, we are in big doo-doo. And nobody wants to think that. And then there's another element. I think it's because we have this herd instinct. And we kind of look around and say, well, nobody else seems to be concerned, so I guess I'm not concerned either. Because surely, if there was really something there, wouldn't people be upset by it? So I think we got those two things going against us. And it really takes a lot of conviction and strength to stand up against your peers and speak out on a line of reasoning or fact that is unpopular. It takes strength to do that. And nobody wants to do that because sometimes you get looked at funny. And people might even call you names. Or increasingly I get letters, emails from people saying, please take me off your list because I don't want to be on any list when they come looking for people like you. So all of those things, I suppose, would be my answer. Probably no one thing. But underlying it all, probably the most important, and the one I didn't mention, but it just popped into my mind, and that is that they're not really convinced yet. They need a little more convincing. And then I think some more facts, some more arguments,
some more evidence of some kind, a lot of those people will be pushed over the edge and become human dynamos of action. And I hope that there are many more like that. I hope it's not too late.
Are we going to get from where we are now to the republic that you're talking about? Are we going to get there peacefully, or is it going to be by some other means?
Well, the honest answer is I don't know. I hope, of course, it will be through peaceful means. However, my reading of history is that big changes, with one exception, big changes always are accompanied by violent moves. And the one exception is the one we just went through. Our government was stolen from us, not in a violent revolution, but through nonviolent revolution, through gradually taking over the medium of communications, education, this, that, and the other thing, politics, controlling the power centers of society. When you come to the Freedom Force website, you'll see a lot about that issue. How is it possible for these collectivists to literally conquer a nation without firing a shot? And they do it by taking over the power centers of society. They become leaders of the power centers, meaning those groups and organizations that influence the public policy of the nation. Political parties, church organizations, labor unions, media centers, think tanks, large corporations, and so forth. And that's how they did it. The organization called the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the outgrowth of that Rhodesian group I mentioned a moment ago, it's the American branch of, admittedly, is a secret society, but this is the public version of that secret society. It's the outer ring that they allow the public to see, called the Council on Foreign Relations. It has about 4,000 members. It's not a lot. There are a lot of churches, probably in this community here, that have that kind of membership or more. And yet, when you look at the power centers of society, the political parties, the government agencies, the people that really determine things, you'll find that most of them are dominated by these 4,000 people. They're everywhere. But not just everywhere. They're not out there turning a wrench on your sink. They're heads of organizations. They're the leaders. And they're leading other people. So that's how they do it. So getting back to the question, can this be reversed peacefully in the same manner? We are counting on it. That's the whole purpose of Freedom Force, is to reverse that process. And to have people such as you all here, we agree on basic principles. Hopefully, let's get together. Let's go back into these power centers of society and recapture them. We don't have to do it with force of arms. In fact, that's not how it's done. Now, the question, though, is will that be possible? Will they let us do that? No, they won't let us do it because we'll have to fight our way into it. Parliamentary action. How many people have ever read Robert's Rules of Order? Well, you better get a copy and memorize it because that's where the battlefield is, and that'll be one of your weapons. Things like that, you see. Will it still devolve into physical violence, revolution on the streets? I don't know, but I sure hope not. Because if it ever should come to that, I'm afraid it's going to be a long, dark ages before we can recover. Yes?
First of all, I just want to thank you for coming. It's been a real inspiration hearing you speak in person. Sorry. My question for you is, with the complacency of Congress enforcing an audit of the Federal Reserve, how are we supposed to bring the crimes of these criminal bankers to light, and more importantly, get the power of the purse back with the people?
Okay, I'm having a little trouble hearing this, but if I heard that correctly, you were saying, can we get an audit of the Fed, and how do we bring these people to justice and get the power of the purse back? Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, obviously we do not have or access to the major channels of communication. If we did that, if we had a truly free and independent press, it would be a piece of cake. In fact, we wouldn't even be in the mess we're in now, because all of the things we're talking about would have been in the press. But That's not the way it is. One of the power centers of society is the media, and they were very wise in capturing control of that decades ago. So how do we get around that? The only way is through new channels of communication. Fortunately, the internet has arrived at precisely the right time in history for that, because it makes it possible for people like us to reach out to millions of people. There are things I've noticed every once in a while. You see some video, it goes viral, they say. The same thing happens with a news article. It'll go viral, and you look at the numbers, and gosh, it just reached 82 million people by breakfast, and tomorrow it's 122 million, and so forth. We can go viral on the internet, at least for now. Of course, they're working very hard to control the internet in the name of national security and fight pornography and all these other good things, but we know that the real objective is to control the internet so that the things we're talking about here today do not get broadcast. So all I can say is we have to keep plugging away on the alternative means of communication. We will never be able to bring these people to justice until the power of the state is returned to the people, because the power of the state is what brings those to justice. It would be the police and the courts and the penal system. And as long as that is in the hands of our opponents, then that is not going to happen. But nevertheless, once we have access to the people through alternative media of communications, then we can tackle the problem of recapturing the power centers of government. Once that happens, the game is over. We can do it. And recapturing the power of the purse is simply the same way to get the right people into positions of state authority. I won't use the word government because I don't want a government. I want a protectorate. So I'll say getting the right people in control of the protectorate. It's a long road to go. I don't expect to see it in my lifetime, but I do expect that there are people here that will see it in their lifetime if we get humping on it right away. Okay.
All right, guys, this will be the last question, and then you can meet outside for pictures if you're interested. So, one more. All right, cool.
Getting back to an individual living in the society, I've heard people becoming sovereign citizens. Can you explain that and what your thoughts are on possibly resisting that way?
Well, I have mixed emotions. People to be thinking of the fact that they are the source of sovereign power, or should be the source of sovereign power in our constitutional republic. That's the way it was designed to be. And I think it's healthy to think on those lines and ponder the way it should be, the way it was, and the way we need to make it again. But what worries me is when people will say, well, I am a sovereign citizen, because the Constitution says so, or for some other reason, or because I simply will it, then they are putting themselves into direct confrontation with the power of the state. The state will come along and say, you say you're a sovereign citizen, into the truck. What are you going to do? You're not a sovereign citizen under the present system that we live today. So I think it's necessary to be clear on that issue. And now the argument, I know a counter-argument against what I just said is that, well, if we don't start standing up and exercising our rights, we'll never have them. We've got to stand up and do what is right regardless of the consequences. And that's a powerful argument. I would say that if enough people were to do that, it would be true. But for one person to do it, it's like being on the battlefield and there's a machine gun nest up there, and they have a commanding view of the hillside, and you've got to take that machine gun nest somehow. So you say, well, let's see, I could lay low, I could wait till dark, I could go around, see if there's a ravine and come in from the backside, or I could just jump up and say, here I come. It's a question of strategy. I think needs to be considered too. So I say, in my view, it's a mixed bag. I like the idea, but I urge people to be very cautious of where they take that idea today. Thank you again. Thank you so much.